This podcast is sponsored by TGO Magazine.
Hello and welcome to the TGO Show, the on-air version of Britain's fresh air magazine, The Great Outdoors. My name's Bob Cartwright, and on this third TGO Show, we take something of a conservation theme and challenge you in more ways than one. The October issue of TGO Magazine carries the entry forms for next year's TGO Challenge, the biggest and best backpacking event in the world. And we'll be hearing from event coordinator Roger Smith why you need to get your entries in as early as possible. And here's another challenge. Cameron McNeish describes a hilltop in one of the best-loved areas of England. Can you identify where he is, with a prize for the winner? Nick Kempe, a former president of the Mountaineering Council of Scotland, will be telling us about his new book, Hostile Habitats, and why it could change your perspectives as a hill walker. Dick Balharry, chairman of the John Muir Trust, launches the Trust's campaign against the siting of industrial-sized wind farms in areas of wild land. And Mike Harding enjoys a good moan about this summer's hot weather. Why? Well, he spent the month of July on the rain-soaked west coast of Ireland. You can't win them all, Mike. But first, many of you will be aware of the controversy surrounding the erection of hundreds of giant wind turbines in some of the UK's wild areas. In Scotland alone, there are some 400 planning applications in the pipeline, and the conservation organisation, the John Muir Trust, says enough is enough. The Trust has just launched a campaign to try and persuade the government to come up with a proper strategy for siting these wind farms, with due regard for the impact they can have on our finest areas of wild land. Cameron McNeish spoke to JMT chairman Dick Balharry and asked him to outline the Trust's objections to onshore wind farms.
We understand that renewables are needed. They are essential to get our carbon emissions down. So we support renewables. But the industrial size of wind farming across our landscape is against the very principles of what we stand for. It is damaging to the environment. It's damaging to people in many ways, because it's people that come there to enjoy those areas, and we don't need them. And I think also the economics of them are very suspect.
The renewables people would say that the effects of global warming can do a lot more damage to the landscape than a few temporary turbines. So how would you argue against that? Well,
if you think of the carbon emissions that are used in the construction of those very big wind turbines, then very often they are negative. In other words, the concrete, the transport, the damage to peat, which loses carbon all the time, is so great that if you use 20 years as a lifetime of a turbine, one of these big turbines, then it is negative. So more and more, what we must be doing is certainly using renewables, wind included, but in communities, for communities, right across our landscape, meaning that in urban areas we have many more, rather than putting them in the very special places that we've all come to enjoy.
Now, you mentioned these special places. The leaflet you've produced lays great emphasis on wild land. Could you maybe just explain to me what your definition is of wild land?
Wild land is areas that are fairly remote from industrialised sites throughout Scotland. But wild land is something that we all believe in. Each individual will have their own wild land. But the wild land we're talking about is the areas of Scotland that are really magnificent. And we've only got to think of places like the Cuillins. We think of High Nevis. We think of all the way through the Trossachs and really into Inverness-shire, all the way through Argyll. Many, many of those places removed from the communities, but in areas of where people either drive or walk to really feel refreshed and new. And it's that sort of essence of getting into those areas to enjoy Scotland. And I believe this is not something that is uneconomic, it's something against social interest. On the contrary, I think this is very much what we should be doing, and we should have really good planning to protect those areas, rather than the way things are going at the moment in some areas.
Is the GMT opposition to large-scale wind farm developments purely on visual grounds? Simply that these giant turbines spoil the view, or other reasons?
I think there are very many other reasons. Certainly the view is one, But, I understand, along with many other people who live in the Highlands, we can't live on views alone. It's very much more than that. And if you had one of those big turbines right beside your home, for example, then you wouldn't like that either. But equally, each home, I think, has a responsibility to use less and to produce more. And why not have small turbines on your chimneys? Why not have something in your garden? Why not have solar panels? Underground heating. There's so many things that we can do and we must do. And I think there are signs that government are waking up to those ideas, and incentives for those would be so much better than putting in these monsters in the hill. It'll take a long, long time to ever get them removed.
And of course, we're not just talking about massive turbines, we're also talking about the grid lines that kind of link all these things together.
Yes, more and more that this network of industrialisation right throughout Scotland, particularly the Highlands, is going to be a change that we will find it very difficult to remedy. We can't remedy that, certainly in the next 100, 200 years. And there are ways and means using better renewables, tidal and wave power are something that we haven't really touched, and why not? We should be really doing a lot more in renewables.
What can people do about this, Dick? People who are concerned. There is a feeling going around that you can't object to these things, and the local planning authority may well rule them out. But then it goes to the Scottish Executive, or it goes to government in England and Wales, and they overturn these things through public inquiries. There's a great feeling of helplessness. What can people do?
I think we live in a democracy, and we all got to see that democracy has done some great things, and we're part of it. So more and more, we really have to speak up and say what you think, go to your politicians and speak to them, and give good reasoning, good evidence for what it is that you want, either in a community or individuals, because clearly, if we allow this to just progress, snowball, we will lose the very essence of why people come here to enjoy Scotland, why people come into the Highlands to live there and get a quality of life that can't be found anywhere else. So this is a really important issue. So please, please think about it. And if you do not like those areas being industrialised in the way that we've described, then do something about it. Speak to your politicians and speak to your councillors in order to persuade them that your views are every bit as important as the politicians.
Now, many people listening to this may well want to join the John Muir Trust to join your campaign against these industrial wind farms in wildland areas. So what is the John Muir Trust going to be doing in a sense of campaigning? You've produced this leaflet, you're encouraging people to join. What's the way ahead for the John Muir Trust?
We will continue to campaign against wind turbines of a size and nature where they are damaging to wildland. Wherever it be, in UK terms, not just in Scotland, in UK terms. And that doesn't mean to say that we're against renewables. We are not. We are for it. But clearly we need to do this in a much more sensible way, using the renewables, but at the same time not really putting great stress and damage on our beautiful and very important landscapes.
And if you can help the John Muir Trust in its campaign, we'd encourage you to do so. Remember the words of John Muir himself. Do something for wildness and make the mountains glad. Check out the Trust website at www.jmt.org. Well, the organisers of the TGO Challenge are bracing themselves for a huge entry to next year's event, following the response to the 10 half-hour podcasts I made earlier this year. A quick plug, you can always check them out and see what the TGO Challenge is all about at www.backpackinglight.co.uk. TGO Deputy Editor John Manning has been going over the special 16-page challenge pullout in October's TGO magazine with event coordinator Roger Smith. John asked him if he's ready for the entry onslaught.
There certainly appears to be a lot of interest, which is great. We're always very, very pleased to welcome our friends old and new from overseas, and I'm sure next year we'll get a particularly good entry. And now, of course, we're coming up to the time when the October issue of TGO comes out with all the details of the challenge in it. The October issue contains a wonderful 16-page feature, a special on the challenge. We've got accounts of this year's crossing. We've got A lot of information about gear, which is an endlessly fascinating topic for challengers, and we have the entry forms for the 2007, which is the 28th time this wonderful event will have been held. All the details are in there. Read the notes carefully and complete the application form and shoot it off to me. My name and all the details are in there, so it should be fairly straightforward. All we require from you is the completed form, the payment, and a stamped reply envelope.
And how long have people got to get their entries into you?
Yeah, that's a point that's definitely worth noting, because we do say that entries will close on the 20th of October. The event is limited for environmental and logistical reasons to a total of 300 people taking part. We fully expect it to be oversubscribed, so there is only a limited time for you to enter. So get the magazine, get writing, get the forms completed, and get them into me as soon as you can.
That's great. And this year, the TGO Challenge and TGO have entered a new partnership.
Yeah, this is tremendously exciting news that we are now have a partner for the challenge in RAB, the equipment company who make tremendous outdoor gear, as a lot of people will know. And we look forward very much to working with them over the years ahead to continue to develop our links with them and continue to develop the challenge itself. It has a great reputation already, the TGO Challenge. It's been on the go since 1980, so this will be the 28th time it'll have been held. The format has not changed, but the spirit of the event continues to improve and is enhanced every year by those taking part. And I'm sure 2007 will be the best challenge yet.
This year you had a lot of trouble with wet weather. What do you plan to do about the weather for 2007?
I think appeasing the weather gods is never easy, John. You know that. We used to settle on May because it was a nice time of year. The sun shone and everybody had a great time, but it doesn't happen anymore. You just have to take whatever the weather throws at you. And certainly on the 2006 challenge, we had absolutely everything from nice warm days with sunshine to snow falling even at relatively low levels. So that's one of the things that we do advise people taking part. You just come prepared for anything.
Just again, the closing date for entry forms to you?
Friday the 20th of October. Don't miss it.
Roger Smith there, and if I were you, I would take his advice. Get your entry in as early as you possibly can. And once again, entry forms and details are in the October issue of TGO Magazine. Or check out the website www.tgomagazine.co.uk for subscription details. Now, I wonder if, like many of us, you spend your days on the trail or walking the hills, possibly with your head down looking at your feet, completely oblivious to the birds, plants, landforms and geology around you. If you do, then Nick Kempe and Mark Wrightham have just produced a book called Hostile Habitats, a hill walker's guide to Scotland's landscape and wildlife. The book describes and illustrates many of the plants that can be found on the Scottish hills. It also describes the geological foundations of Scotland, the vegetation cover of the hills, invertebrate life, mountain birds, mammals, reptiles and amphibians. In short, all the features you'd want to recognise and identify as a hill walker, and all in one single book. Cameron caught up with one of the authors, ex-Mountaineering Council of Scotland boss Nick Kempe, and asked him how the idea for the book came about.
The idea was provoked by a couple of different things. The first was my experience on the Access Forum, where there have been a number of times when the landowning and other interests have been saying, well, we need to restrict access because it does damage to the natural heritage, to wildlife. And I started looking into this and looked into some of the research, and I realised that wasn't the case. There wasn't any real evidence of walkers damaging wildlife. But then in the arguments involved in that, I got involved in saying, well, education is the key thing. As long as what damage happens accidentally. So if people are more aware of things, they're less likely to, say, step on the nest of nesting dotterel on the Cairngorms Plateau or something like that. So some of the experience came out of the Access Forum, and there was also, actually, believe it or not, if you remember Lord Burton in Glen Shiel, well, there was some stramash at the time about hill walkers and so on, and there was a hill walking survey at the time, and I remember reading that when I was at the Mountaineering Council of Scotland, and actually what came out was people were asked what was the most interesting thing they'd seen on the hill, and someone said a frog was, I think, the main thing that came out. I thought, well, actually, there's more interesting things to see in Glen Shiel. I mean, the geology and everything is absolutely fantastic there, and people just aren't seeing it. So the idea behind the book was partly to really help people who go hill walking to see and hear more when they're on the hill and get more out of their hill day.
Have you found that hill walkers and climbers become a little frustrated when they can't identify plants and landforms and things? Or is our sort of hill walking, mountaineering culture really all about peak bagging these days?
Well, I don't think it's all about peak bagging. I think that there's a lot, and obviously there's a lot of motivation to get to the top, and actually planning your next peak or planning your next climb is a key thing about it. And I think what's always been very strong among hill walkers has been the sense of wildland, so that sense of space and wilderness and being away from things and the absence of man-made construction has always been vital. But what hill walkers have done less so is actually look around at what is at their feet. And I think a lot of people actually just walk by without seeing. And what the book is an attempt to pull together from a lot of various sources the information that might help people see more on their day out and get more out of it. And I hope at the end of the day it'll make people more appreciative of their surroundings.
What are the sources, Nick? Who are all these different authors you've pulled together?
Right. Well, the key thing about the authors is what we chose. Every author is someone who hill walks or climbs, and that was our first criteria for choosing people. We also wanted to get, if you like, some of a younger generation of people, but they're all people who have expertise in their field. Stuart Benn works for the RSPB. He's an expert on birds, but he's also a mad peak bagger, as you'll probably be aware. And I could say the same for all the authors, so they're all dead keen on the hills, and that's the important thing. And what the book's about is them converting a lot of that knowledge that they had and putting it across to hill walkers in an accessible, non-technical form.
One thing that struck me when I read the book was I looked at all the elements that are discussed in the book, the birds, the plants, the landforms, and I kind of realised that everything in there is intertwined, everything is interlinked. Often one thing depends on the other, and it made me realise, in fact, that humankind is part of that whole web of creation.
Completely. And actually, like, the plants you see depend on the underlying geology and soils. The soils are determined by geology, and it's also the climate comes into that. And then all of that overlain on that is past human impacts and land use. And actually, you can see your trip to the hill like almost as one big detective story, as to work out why things are where they are and that why they look as they do.
Do you think this book will help us slow down just a bit and stop and listen and look a bit more?
Best way of seeing more is definitely to stop, be still, listen. I mean, that's particularly the case for birds. If you're moving and so on, birds are unlikely to come as close to you than if you're sitting still. But it's also the case for a whole lot of other things. I was at the weekend up on Milne and Tarmacombe with my daughter, and I was amazed going along the summit ridge there. The plants there are absolutely fantastic. If you drop down just off the summit onto the north side, there's a whole range of wonderful alpine plants. And a lot of people are walking along the ridge and they're stopping and they're not even looking over the edge to see what's there. And even if you don't know what they are, you know, the colours and everything else is absolutely fantastic. And what I also personally, I find really interesting about it is, and why we called the book Hostile Habitats, was that this is a very harsh climate, and the most amazing plants which can survive in appalling conditions where the soil's frozen for a lot of the year, the problems of getting water and things, surviving in that climate is incredible. And when we're on the hill, right, if you imagine spending a couple of nights overnight on the top of a hill in winter, well, for most of us it wouldn't be, you know, even with modern gear, it was a daunting experience. But there's all these there's plants, but there's also creatures, as invertebrates and so on, that are in the soils that survive all that. And I personally find that absolutely incredible. And it's also humbling, you know, in terms of our experience, that actually there are things up there that are much better adapted than we are to those environments.
Hostile Habitats, a new book which Cameron has described as an idiot's guide to what we walk over, through, and what we might see on a day on the Scottish hills. The book is published by the Scottish Mountaineering Trust and costs just £15. I'd also say it would make an ideal companion to take with you on the next TGO challenge. OK, time now for the first TGO Show competition, and it's very simple. Listen to Cameron's description of where he is and try to identify the location. And since it's the first Where Am I competition, we'll give you a little hint. Cameron is somewhere in England.
Being a stickler for accuracy, I'm not really sure if the hill I'm sitting on has been correctly named by the Ordnance Survey. They appear to have shortened it for some reason, deleting a name that's synonymous with adventure films. Now, it's a marvellously pointy little peak, and it's formed by a hard igneous rock that appealed to certain tool makers a long, long time ago. I'm looking down on one of the best-loved views in the best-loved areas of England. Where am I?
So do you know where Cameron is? If you do, put your answers on an email and send it to whereami@tgomagazine.co.uk. That's whereami, all in lowercase, at tgomagazine.co.uk. The first correct answer pulled from the hat on Monday the 2nd of October will win a year's subscription to the magazine. With the autumn fast approaching, memories of the hot summer are also receding. But not for Mike Harding. While we melted and cooked in higher than normal temperatures, Mike had to endure weeks of rain, drizzle and low cloud on the west coast of Ireland. The sun, perhaps, does indeed shine on the righteous.
And running down the grids, hosepipes were turning into dusty snakes at the back of garden sheds, while the Brits were slapping on sun cream inches thick like cross-channel swimmers coating themselves with lard, and while all over the UK people were showing the first signs of barbecue bloat, we here in the west of Ireland watched day after day dissolving into rain and chill winds. Grey cloud down to a couple of 100 feet above sea level, and sideways rain that went from drizzle, a soft day they call it here, to buckets and wheelbarrows full, seemed to roll in day after day. Soggy French students wandered round town wondering why a pint of Guinness and a bottle of mineral water cost as much as a good meal back in France, and gangs of American cyclists of all shapes and sizes, but mostly big, wearing spandex shorts in the kind of colours that would induce an epileptic fit in a four-toed sloth, wobbled round looking for a quiet cafe to sit down and shout in, very loudly. It was pretty glum. Made glummer by the knowledge that the rest of Europe was just about to spontaneously combust. I actually phoned some friends who were on a walking holiday near Inverness, but I put the phone down on them in a well-fitting peak when they said they weren't going too far because they were frightened of heat stroke. At the time, I was suffering from trench foot and rising damp. If you don't believe me, then ask the lads who were laying some granite cobbles outside the house. The cobbles seemed to be taking longer to lay than the Great Wall of China. For a couple of weeks in June, they told me, it was too hot. For much of July and August, it was too wet. The only excuse you haven't used, I said, is that you've been abducted by the little people and dragged off under the mountain to where they're all dancing and leaping about to fairy fiddlers and bongo players at the Dermot and Grania karaoke. It could happen yet, was the reply. There's a lot of them about. Which brings me to my main point. On one of the days when the rain wasn't coming sideways off the Atlantic and the cloud had just about cleared the tips of the 12 bends, I managed a short meander over the nearby hills. Nothing strenuous, you understand, just an afternoon ramble over the old Signal Hill and down to a holy well and bay that I'm quite fond of. From the summit, amidst the ruins of an old British watchtower, I looked back the way I'd come. As I looked around at the land below, I noticed something strange. In a meadow between the bog and the waters of the bay was the face of Marilyn Monroe. Not in colour, you understand, but as though it's been sketched out in charcoal on the emerald grass that's been watered all this bloody summer by the pigging Atlantic rain, while you jammy lot over there have been dripping wet and moaning about not having air conditioning. Anyway, back to the story. There below me, almost filling the field, was the screen idol herself, Mrs. Arthur Miller. I blinked and shook my head to make sure it wasn't a vision induced by water on the brain, but it was still there. Then I noticed that in the next field were some strange Celtic spirals and whorls, again looking like they'd been scrawled on the grass by a giant hand with a huge lump of charcoal. In the next field was a picture of Mickey Mouse, and further along, the head of Saint Fiacre, the patron saint of pile sufferers, taxi drivers and premenstrual women. God help you if you get into a taxi driven by such a one. Next to that was another field full of signs and symbols, yins and yangs, Masonic pyramids and hammers, pentagrams, and Bart Simpson and the Pope arm wrestling. What could all this mean? I took up my binoculars and scanned the land below. In a further meadow there was a massive, partly finished Celtic spiral, an intricate double-headed serpent, such as was found on the breastplate of Cuchulainn when he vanquished the Firbolgs and the Gombeans, led by Niall of the 9 ostriches at the Battle of Magarley. Then I saw them, the makers of this massive earth mystery. A flock of sheep were putting the finishing touches to Cuchulainn's sword with a few well-aimed dollops of poo. While scientists and earth watchers on the south of England have been puzzling over mysterious crop circles, here in the west of Ireland we had our very own crap circles. What is the meaning of all this? Did these sheep go to art school? If so, why aren't they pickling Damien Hirst in formaldehyde and selling him to Mr. Saatchi? Are these crap circles signs for visitors from outer space? Is that where Fianna Fáil come from? Was Charlie Haughey an alien? Are the Coors really human? And what about Daniel O'Donnell and his mummy with her cups of tea? I slumped down onto the sward on the summit of the hill, poleaxed, perplexed, and something else with X in it. I hurried off down the mountain and phoned the guards, but they were all out breathalyzing people as they were coming out of church. I was going to ask the lads who were laying the cobbles, but when I got back they'd gone, and the cobbles still weren't finished. And since that day they haven't been back. So all I can think is that the aliens must have taken them. I sit in the house now, looking out at the rain sweeping over the land. Above me on the hill, the sheep are munching the mountain and making even more signs. And I'm sure they're looking through the window at me.
Well, that's it for another TGO show. Don't forget to check out the TGO special podcasts on www.theoutdoorschannel.co.uk and check out the TGO subscription rates on www.tgomagazine.co.uk. And remember those words of John Muir: do something for wildness and make the mountains glad. Until next time, this is Bob Cartwright heading for the hills. Bye for now.
This podcast is produced and hosted by The Outdoors Channel. Find out how easy it is to subscribe to all our podcasts by visiting theoutdoorschannel.co.uk.